I was brought up in a place called Bonan in South Kerry, quite close to Kinmare, and I was brought up in a rural post office. And the office hours were not very well observed there. And in particular, on Friday nights, Friday was pension day, so on Friday nights, the men would come in collecting the old age pension. In many cases, it was younger men. We thought they were all old at the time. It was younger men who would be coming in collecting the pensions for their fathers. And my father used to leave us stay up a bit later on Friday night because the men who came in, and it was always men actually, the women never seemed to come out at night, they would be telling us stories, and we loved that, of course. There was no television at this stage. We're talking about the late 50s, early 60s. We wouldn't have had any electricity until about 1964. So we did have gaslight, so they'd come in. There was no television, so it was a great form of entertainment. And they'd be telling us the old legends and old stories, and fairy stories and ghost stories in particular were very popular. And we loved it actually. And then some of the tellers would have been much better than others. There was one man in particular, Florrie McCarthy. Florrie didn't come that regularly, but we love to see Florrie coming because he had all the old, very old stories, and he had a great ability to impart the stories. I subsequently met Florrie's father because my godfather was a man called Paddy Connor, was married to Florrie's sister, and I used to go for weekends to that house. Now, I didn't like going to that house that much because there was no children there. My godfather and his wife didn't have any children, but the old man was there, and he used to be telling me stories as well. And my godfather, Paddy Connor, he was probably the best storyteller that I had ever heard before, after, or since, because he had an innate ability to tell stories, and he was constantly picking up stories. It's mostly about local events or about local people, and he was a first-class mimic as well. In today's terms, he would be as good at taking off the local people as Oliver Callan would be. But he didn't have any exposure to radio or television or to anybody outside of the local community. So, but he would take if he was here now, he'd be studying my mannerisms and your mannerisms, and he'd be imitating us before he left the studio today. But he had a huge range of stories, every kind of story, but a lot of them were, fairly simple stories. But he was amusing as well, and he was absolutely fantastic storyteller. And I think myself, the best storytellers, I think, are the storytellers who can tell about ordinary events in an extraordinary way. And by that I mean they are able to describe the events that would have happened, and to take you to that place. They would describe the locations, they would describe the events as they were happening, they would describe the smells of the place, and they could really build up the atmosphere of the story. And that is, I think, maybe one of the best ways that I would describe a storyteller. So that would be kind of my experience of storytellers in my youth. So we kind of grew up with stories, really. How do I think Irish storytelling has changed over time? Well, I suppose in the old days, the storytelling was told in local houses, in circumstances where there was no other real form of entertainment. There was no television, no radio, so it was a great source of entertainment as such. Now, I think sometimes the storytellers didn't even realize that they were telling stories. They were just talking about events. There'd be a group of people in the room, and I suppose the atmosphere was very important as well. I think I mentioned this earlier. There wouldn't have been any electricity now back in rural Ireland, kind of before the 1950s, and kind of in some places up until the final rural electrification in the early to mid 1960s. So you're talking about some houses would have had gaslight. A lot of them would have just lamps, maybe candles, and the firelight. So you can imagine somebody sitting by the fire, and you have the flames kind of flickering in his face, and there he's telling a story, and then he's telling maybe a ghost story. So it's almost like being in the studio here. It's dark all around the place. So you could almost imagine the ghosts and fairies coming out of every corner, and then somebody might give the door or something a thump, and everybody would jump with fright. So that would have been the kind of the original atmosphere of the stories. And obviously, with the advent of electricity and television and other forms of entertainment, storytelling changed. I mean, a lot of people who were, as I say, who were telling these stories wouldn't necessarily have thought they were telling stories. They'd have been talking about ordinary events. I can remember even more recently, going back, say, to the 1990s. My father was still living in the old home place, and his buddies would come in maybe of a Sunday afternoon, and maybe one or two fellas would come in, or maybe just one, and they'd be telling each other stories about things that happened in the past and discussing things, and they wouldn't even realise they were telling stories. But I mean, some of the stories that they were just telling each other would be just absolutely fantastic. I mean, they were just having a conversation as such, and do you remember such a fellow now there, and you remember such an event, and then they'd go on to tell about the event in the way I've described there earlier. And ordinary, simple things. There wouldn't necessarily be a punchline to the story or anything, but you'd be totally absorbed if you were listening to the story. And I think obviously, as time has gone on, professional storytellers have developed, and they have kind of brought the stories to a different audience. I mean, they'll be telling stories in theatres and at storytelling events and storytelling festivals. And these people will be making a living out of it, and they probably would have brought the storytelling to a more professional level, and they would have honed their stories and made them slightly differently. But the essence of the storytelling hasn't changed over time, really, as I would see it now. It's just a different audience. Maybe it's a different way. Maybe people are more professional in the way they do it. But sometimes, somebody just who stands up at the back of a bar and tells a story, he might be every bit as effective as somebody who's a professional storyteller. And so that's what I would say about that. Has it changed? I suppose maybe the type of stories that are being told has changed a bit. I think that maybe in tourist areas, people who would tell stories, they would be gearing their stories towards a tourist market, and they would be filtering the stories accordingly. But the old stories, the old legends, the ancient legends and things like that are still popular everywhere, and it's just a matter of how it's told. And storytelling has always been a part of our society, and probably a part of every society. If you think back, all the old songs that we had about the old heroes and all the battles and all that, they're all stories. Obviously not everybody can sing, so the ordinary people would have just told the story as opposed to be able to make a song about it. How do I think the future of Irish storytelling will go? It obviously is going to be modernised, and technology is undoubtedly going to play a part in it. With video and with film, a lot of the stories can be brought to life. People who, videographers and filmmakers, they can cast the story, they can get actors to relive some of the old stories, and it's been done very effectively in some cases. My nephew Matt Sullivan there has been doing that for a while, and he's been recreating old legends and old stories, and having them acted out, and it's a very effective way of telling the story, and it's just a modern telling of the story to a new audience. We find the same thing on television now. We have documentaries there which go over old stories and old events, and it's a very good way of telling the stories. Obviously, tape recording or audio recording is also an important facet, because it preserves the stories, and if there are good storytellers who can tell good stories, they will be recorded for posterity, and they can be put in a library or a repository that people can draw on them subsequently. It's a bit like the school's Folklore Collection there of the 1930s that recorded all the local stories and legends at the time, and there are thousands and thousands of pages of that it's online now on Dukas, and it's become accessible to everybody as well. And that's a great record of what the situation was at a particular point in time. But there will always be storytelling, and as well as that, I think there is at the present time there's a resurgence in interest in storytelling, and there's a lot of festivals and storytelling events and storytelling competitions and all that kind of stuff, and it's bringing storytelling to a new audience. But I think there will always be a place for a good storyteller, in a proper setting, who will sit down with a few people, or maybe more than a few people, and tell a story. Because story is what everything is about. When we have a conversation, we're telling a story. I tell you what I did yesterday, or I sit down in the pub and we're talking about something. It's telling a story. Sometimes we don't even realise we're telling stories. There are a lot of stories that I like, that I like, but I can't say that there's any particular one story that kind of jumps out at me. I like all the stories in general. Probably the best story I've ever heard, which is a very long story, it's a story called I think it's called The Sweet Shop in the Corner. Kate Corkery tells the story. It's quite a long story. It's about her upbringing down in, I think it's Passage West, and it just goes through the various characters. It's kind of a one-woman show, and it goes on for about an hour. And that's I've seen her tell that story a number of times, and I'd go to see it again. I think that's absolutely fantastic. I like kind of maybe a modern twist on some of the stories that we hear nowadays. If I was to say a personal story, there's a story that my godfather used to tell about a station mass, and that would be one of my favourite stories of all time, because he just told it so well.
You have been listening to The Digital Hearth.